I want to pose the question how to frame early Islam. This is the problem that I place at the focal point of the large-scale narrative history of the first millennium, from Augustus to Avicenna, that you kindly mentioned in your introduction, and on which I'm working, and I can assure you without undue stress. Now, framing early Islam is problematic because study of pre-Islam, in other words, late antiquity, conventionally ends round about 600, just when things are getting really exciting. Despite his early 1971 opening to the Islamicate world, Peter Brown, my undergraduate teacher, much admired, never engaged in depth with that perspective. Perhaps he was put off by the plague of hyper-skepticism that hit the study of early Islam soon afterwards, from 1977. Study of late antiquity therefore remains primarily concerned with the formation of Christendom, viewed from the Mediterranean and Europe. Gibbon's inclusion of Muhammad and the successive caliphates in his great history of empire from the Antonines to 1453 has not had many imitators, or even, relatively speaking, many readers, compared, I mean, to the first 38 chapters of his book, which got him as far as 476, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, since 2019, we have a new historiographical milestone in the shape of the Tübingen historian Mischa Meyer's 1,532-page Geschichte der Völkerwanderung, History of the Migration Period, Europe, Asia, and Africa, from the 3rd to the 8th century. That's how the subtitle goes. Meyer opens his subject up to Asia and Africa, rather than perpetuating the Germanocentric view of the so-called barbarian invasions that has long prevailed in Europe, not only in Germany. Although Meyer's center of gravity remains Europe and the Mediterranean, he deals also with the Sassanids and with early Islam, following Peter Brown's example and concluding his narrative in the 8th century, as did Peter. I'm talking, of course, about Peter Brown's World of Late Antiquity book of 1971. Now, critical reaction to Meyer has been positive in the German-speaking world. Geschichte der Völkerwanderung has already been described as, I quote, I'm taking this from the only English language review that I've so far located, the best introduction to the political history of late antiquity available in any scholarly language. Now, given that the nascent caliphate absorbed the Sassanid Empire wholesale and all Rome's Levantine and North African provinces, it is obvious that early Muslims could not help engaging with a spectrum of pre-Islamic social, economic, and administrative structures and cultural habits. In attempting to embed early Islam in this broad framework, and thereby in our wider curricula of historical study, Meyer invokes his theory of Liturgisierung that he already developed in earlier studies, especially of the Emperor Justinian. This term, Liturgisierung, rather hideously rendered into English as liturgification, had been allusively deployed by, among others, Otto Treitinger in the 1930s and by Averell Cameron in influential articles published in the late 1970s. But the theme is richly developed by Meyer, who not only describes the phenomena concerned, but imbues them with causative force. For Meyer, liturgification denotes a growing focus, triggered especially by the Great Plague of 541, the so-called Justinianic Plague, on the Christian supernatural world as a recourse in times of stress and danger. Mary the Theotokos, or God-bearer, therefore, icons, communal rituals such as processions, holy men or an emperor posing as one in the case of Justinian, all loom large in Mayer's vision of the 6th and 7th centuries as divine defenders against pandemic and war. Contemporaries do often allude to supernatural protection of East Roman cities. A relic of the true cross protects Syrian Apamea in 540. Christ saves Edessa from a Sassanid siege in 544. The Theotokos delivers Constantinople from simultaneous sieges by Avars and Iranians in 626. Our sources for all this are, of course, literary, so subject to all the usual reservations. But the sheer abundance of 6th century hagiography, for instance, has to be taken seriously. Meyer also makes reasonable use of archaeology, which sometimes confirms that Liturgisierung did indeed affect public discourse, as when copies of Jesus' famous letter to King Abgar of Edessa are found inscribed on the gates of other cities too, not just Edessa. That does strongly suggest that the beliefs in question were widely held. The same message is conveyed by the ruins of conspicuously large basilicas, richly adorned and well adapted for liturgical processions, both indoors and out, that litter the sites of 6th century cities, especially in the Mediterranean world. Now, nobody will deny that Christian faith and practices pervaded the public doctrine of the 6th century empire or the private practices of its subjects, and must surely have imparted resilience to their confrontation with the hard realities of those times. But did liturgification really, as Misha Meyer argues, I quote him, introduce stabilizing processes that ultimately saved society from collapse in the later 6th century, unquote? Liturgification's impact on historical causation is, in fact, in my opinion, eminently debatable. Even our 6th century literary sources offer glimpses of more skeptical attitudes, which prevailed in some circles, and the limits of liturgification. Hagiographers, for example, dwelt with shameless schadenfreude on the travails of those who doubted their saint's power. The historian Theophylact relates how in the year 588, the Emperor Maurice's army on the eastern frontier revolted after a pay cut. An icon of Christ was sent to calm things down, a good example of liturgification in the army as well. But the icon was pelted with stones by the soldiers. Maurice himself, as emperor, supposedly the primary beneficiary of the notion that the empire was God protected, was murdered with peculiar brutality after being forced to watch the execution of 5 of his sons in front of his eyes. His successor, Phocas, met a similar end. His successor, in turn, the Emperor Heraclius, in 630, triumphantly returned to Jerusalem the relic of the true cross that the Sassanid invaders had removed. Yet, much good did it do him. Within a few years, the Arabs expelled Heraclius from the whole Levant. Liturgisierung undoubtedly mirrored beliefs that either softened or intensified reactions to events. But divisions within the church, especially over Christology, the doctrine of Christ, created alternative and competing modes of sacralization and liturgification. The failures of emperors might foster doubts about not only the ruler himself, but also the whole ecclesiastical and para-ecclesiastical apparatus that supported him. So I repeat my question, can liturgification really be regarded as causative of the great movements of history? Now, Meyer goes so far as to suggest that, I quote him again, liturgification created the enabling space in which Islam could come into being. Specifically, that Heraclius' spectacular show at Jerusalem in 630, the first visit by a Roman emperor since Hadrian's precisely 500 years earlier, along with his projection of a Christ-like image of himself, and more generally his holy war, provoked Muhammad's first raids on southern Palestine in the year 629. Maya writes, "I would interpret the campaigns as a reaction to Heraclius's self-representation in the holy city of Jerusalem, which was extremely important for the Muslims, and I might add parenthetically, according to Fred Donner, a possible reason for their early interest in northward campaigning. If this theory is correct," Maya continues, "the dynamism of the subsequent Arab expansion will have received vital impetus from the Restitutio Crucis, the restoration of the Holy Cross to Jerusalem." End of quotation. Maya is aware that the inauguration of northward raiding several years before 630, in fact, probably from about 625, weakens his argument for a direct link with Heraclius's triumph. Furthermore, from the viewing point of Arabia and of Arab fighters motivated, at least in part, by plunder, the most interesting thing about the political conjuncture in 629 to 30 was surely, and rather obviously, I'd have thought, that the Sassanid and Roman empires had exhausted each other and looked like easy prey. If we also want a faith impulse to help us understand Arab successes, we must look to the Quran and to any early material evidence for the nature of Islam. So, what does this search reveal? A conviction in the Quran's Surah 30 that the Romans will win in the end, an outcome which seems to be viewed positively, but also a distinctly ambiguous, on balance, negative appreciation of the activities of monks and rabbis, strong deprecation of Christian doctrinal strife, depiction of Mary not as all-conquering Theotokos, but as a woman exhausted, hungry and thirsty in the pains of childbirth, clinging to the trunk of a palm tree and wishing she were dead. Prayer halls and liturgy of striking plainness without images or a clerical hierarchy, no saint or relic cult, no mediators. Not liturgy, except for the Hajj, but law and discipline, submission was what Muhammad diagnosed as best for his followers. Maya is perhaps, in my view, on safer ground when he argues that, I quote, "the Caliph Umar's entrance into the newly conquered Jerusalem in 638, just 8 years after Heraclius, represented no less than a deliberate counterproduction of the Restitutio Crucis 8 years earlier." End of quotation. But this is a question of self-representation and diplomacy. It does not touch the essential question about the cause of Umar's presence in Jerusalem in the first place. Now, Maya recently got into a lively dispute about historical methodology in relation to the plague pandemic that started in 541. This was the trauma that Maya sees as triggering liturgification, or at least its most intense phase. His opponents are an international interdisciplinary team of environmental historians. They've been using a quantitative approach based on data sets derived from standard historical sources like coins, inscriptions, papyri, but also pollen archaeology, to dispute the popular but by no means universal maximalist view, accepted in a moderate version by Maya, that the Justinianic pandemic caused tens of millions of deaths, bordering on population collapse. Maya is surely right that the pandemic evoked deep-seated anxieties that required sensitive handling by the authorities, especially regarding religious practices, an emotionally charged feature of our own recent encounter with COVID-19. But was it really such a deep trauma with all the immediate liturgificatory consequences that Maya proposes? As a humane text-based scholar, Maya argues for broad contextualization against the scientist's focus on quantifiable data sets. Posed in this either-or form, the debate is more than a little misguided, since both bodies of evidence are random and hard to interpret at this distance in time. but the contextualizing approach, if rigorously applied, shows Christian Rome had been liturgifying long before 540. Think of Theodosius II, whose organization of public rituals in times of stress, this is in the first half of the 5th century, turned all Constantinople into one great church, says the ecclesiastical historian Socrates. Think of Theodosius I's public humiliation when Bishop Ambrose of Milan excluded him from the liturgy, or Constantine and the tent church he took on campaign against Iran. Looking forward, note how recurrent the plague was, well into the 8th century, it seems, with serious impact on the Arab armies in 630s Syria, and longer term, arguably, on the sustainability of the Umayyad Caliphate. To conclude, I already indicated that I don't see the Quran as a product of liturgificatory impulse. That is not the same thing as denying a liturgificatory role to the Quran itself as a physical object. Perhaps we may see Muawiyah's followers affixing Qurans, perhaps amulets or phylacteries containing brief texts, to their spears at the Battle of Siffin in this context, just as pre-Islamic Arabs had gone into battle carrying, quoting the poet Akhtal, a cross held high and St. Sergius, presumably his relic or icon. Or consider the evidence for large and beautiful Qur'ans produced under the early Umayyads, presumably for public display in major mosques, just like the Gospel book on the altar or the Torah scroll in its shrine. More generally, we know that Islam was to develop an intense popular piety and all sorts of liturgificatory practices condemned by scholars but relished by the ordinary faithful. One recalls, whether or not one believes, the tradition according to which Muhammad, the day he conquered Mecca, had the holy images in the Kaaba destroyed, except paintings of Jesus and Mary. The point of nascent Islam, after all, was that it did not merely reiterate in Arabic the Jewish and Christian prophets, but instead set up corrective tensions within the cultures that framed it. Thank you.